Margaret was sitting in the small wooden chair, staring out the dirty window of the nursing home. The peeling walls and cold floor mirrored the sense of abandonment that filled her heart. She never imagined her days would end here, forgotten and alone. Her grandchildren, the same ones she raised with so much love, had left her in this humble place, visiting only once to sign the papers to ensure she stayed until her death. The memories of a life full of achievements and happy moments now seemed distant. The mansion that was once filled with laughter and parties was empty. Her grandchildren only thought about the inheritance, impatient to take possession of the assets she had worked so hard to accumulate over the years. The pain of betrayal was almost unbearable, but what hurt the most was the loneliness. Margaret tried to distract herself with the sound of the television in the common room, but nothing filled the emptiness inside her. She watched other residents receive occasional visits from their families, while hers never showed up. Each time the door opened, a vain hope arose in her chest, only to be crushed when it wasn't for her. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," said one of the caregivers, passing by quickly. Margaret just nodded, not in the mood to talk. She felt invisible, a shadow of who she once was. The only thing that brought her some comfort was her diary. In it, she wrote about her days, her emotions, and secret hopes that someone would care. Each page was a reflection of her soul, a silent cry for attention and affection. One cold afternoon, while writing another entry in her diary, a young cleaning lady entered the room. Margaret didn't look up, used to the indifferent presence of the staff. "Hi, I'm Clara. Can I clean here?" The voice was soft, different from the mechanical tone Margaret was used to hearing. "Sure, dear," Margaret replied, lifting her eyes for the first time. There was something different about Clara, something that made Margaret feel a faint spark of hope. As Clara cleaned, she began to chat casually. "You know, my grandmother always said we should take care of each other. I think she was right." Margaret smiled for the first time in a long while. Maybe, just maybe, someone in this place genuinely cared about her. When Clara finished, she looked at Margaret with a warm smile. "If you need anything, Mrs. Margaret, I'll be around." "Thank you, Clara," said Margaret, feeling a small but significant change in her heart. And so, in that humble nursing home, Margaret began to realize that even amidst loneliness and abandonment, there was still hope and kindness to be found. The following week, Margaret eagerly awaited Clara's visit. The young cleaning lady had become a light in her dark days. Clara always arrived with a smile and a warm greeting, making the place feel less heavy and more welcoming. "Coffee, Mrs. Margaret?" Clara asked, entering the room with a tray. "Yes, please, dear," Margaret replied, smiling. Clara placed the tray on the small table next to the bed and sat in the chair. "You know, my mother always said that a hot cup of coffee can work wonders." Margaret laughed. "Your mother was a wise woman." As Margaret drank the coffee, Clara began to talk about her life. She spoke about her husband John, who was also a cleaner, and about their 3 children. Margaret listened attentively, feeling a growing connection with Clara. The young woman spoke with such love and care about her family that Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy, but also a warm comfort. "I know it's not easy being here, away from your family," Clara said gently, "but I believe that as long as we have someone who cares, we're never really alone." "You're very kind, Clara," said Margaret, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't know how much your words mean to me." Clara took Margaret's hand. "I know you miss your grandchildren, but I'm here for anything you need. We can talk, walk in the garden, whatever you want." Margaret squeezed Clara's hand. "You're an angel, my dear, a true angel." From that day on, Clara visited Margaret whenever she could. They walked through the small garden of the nursing home, where Clara showed her the flowers and shared stories about her childhood. Margaret began to open up more, sharing tales of her glory days, her achievements, and her sorrows. Sometimes, "All we need is someone to listen to us," Clara said during one of these walks, "and I'm here to listen to you, always." These visits became the highlight of Margaret's days. She eagerly awaited each new conversation, each new story Clara had to tell, and slowly, the darkness that had dominated her heart began to give way to new hope. One afternoon, while Clara was brushing Margaret's hair, the elderly woman asked, "Do you think you could take me to meet your family someday?" Clara smiled, moved. "Of course, Mrs. Margaret. They would love to meet you." Margaret felt a long-forgotten joy. For the first time in a long while, she felt that good things were still ahead, and it was all thanks to Clara, who, with her kindness and simplicity, was giving Margaret back her will to live. The following Saturday, Clara arrived at the nursing home with a sparkle in her eyes. "Mrs. Margaret, today is the big day. I'm taking you to meet my family." Margaret felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. It had been years since she had gone to visit anyone. "I'm ready, Clara," she said, trying to contain her emotions. They took a bus, and after a few minutes they arrived at a small house in the suburbs. The house was simple, but there was something welcoming about its appearance. Clara helped Margaret off the bus, and together they walked to the door. "Welcome to our home, Mrs. Margaret," Clara said, opening the door and revealing a cozy little living room decorated with care. The furniture was modest, but the atmosphere exuded warmth. John, Clara's husband, stood up from the couch and smiled. "Hello, Mrs. Margaret. It's a pleasure to have you with us." He extended his hand, which Margaret gratefully shook. Clara's 3 children came running in. The eldest, Lucas, was 12, with a serious but kind demeanor. Maria, 8, was a smiling, curious girl, and little Pedro, 5, was in a wheelchair, his eyes shining with excitement. "Hi, Grandma Margaret," Maria exclaimed, hugging the elderly woman. Margaret laughed, surprised and moved. "Hello, dear. It's a pleasure to meet all of you." Clara helped Margaret settle into a comfortable armchair, while John brought tea and cookies. "I hope you like tea," he said, serving the elderly lady. "I love it, thank you," Margaret replied, feeling embraced by the family's hospitality. The hours passed quickly as everyone chatted animatedly. Margaret shared stories from her youth, while Clara and John talked about the challenges and joys of raising their children. Lucas showed Margaret his drawings, and Maria recited a poem she had learned in school. Pedro, though silent, kept smiling at Margaret, who felt a special connection with the boy. "You are a wonderful family," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you for welcoming me like this." "We should be thanking you, Mrs. Margaret," John said. "You've brought joy into our home." At lunchtime, Clara insisted that Margaret stay and try the meal they had prepared together. The smell of home-cooked food filled the house, and Margaret felt her heart warm even more. As they ate, Margaret observed the loving interaction between Clara and John and how they cared so tenderly for their children. She realized that despite financial hardships, this family had something money couldn't buy: true love and unity. After lunch, Clara took Margaret for a walk in the small garden behind the house. "It's simple, but we love spending time here," Clara said, holding Margaret's hand. Margaret took a deep breath, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of the simple flowers Clara tended with such care. "It's beautiful, Clara. Really beautiful." At the end of the visit, Margaret bid farewell to the family with a warm hug. "Thank you so much for today. It was one of the happiest days I've had in a long time." "Come back any time you want, Mrs. Margaret," John said, smiling. Clara accompanied Margaret back to the nursing home. On the way, Margaret reflected on everything she had experienced that day. For the first time in years, she felt part of something bigger, felt loved and valued. "Clara, you and your family are a treasure," Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much for sharing this with me." "We should be thanking you, Mrs. Margaret," Clara replied, smiling. "You are always welcome in our home." That night, Margaret slept with a light heart and a smile on her face. She knew that despite everything, there was still goodness in the world. and, thanks to Clara and her family, she had rediscovered the joy of living. That night, after visiting Clara's home, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the kindness and generosity of that family. They, who had so little, shared everything with her without expecting anything in return. This made her reflect on her own grandchildren and the greed that consumed them. The comparison was inevitable and painful. The next day, Margaret called the director of the nursing home. "I would like to speak with a lawyer," she said, her voice firm and determined. "Of course, Mrs. Margaret. I will arrange that for you," replied the director, surprised by the elderly woman's determination. A few hours later, a lawyer arrived at the nursing home. Margaret received him in her room, sitting in her usual chair. "I want to make a change to my will," she announced. The lawyer nodded, taking out a notepad. "I'm at your service, ma'am. How would you like to proceed?" Margaret took a deep breath, thinking about Clara and her family. "I want to leave all my assets to Clara and her family. They are the true definition of kindness and deserve a better life." The lawyer looked at her surprised. "Are you sure about this, ma'am? This is a very important decision." "I am," replied Margaret without hesitation. "My grandchildren already have enough. They don't deserve anything that I have built. Clara and her family, on the other hand, deserve everything. They showed me what true love and compassion are." The lawyer made the necessary notes and explained the process to make the change official. Margaret listened attentively, feeling more relieved with each word. "We will need the signatures of some witnesses," said the lawyer. "That won't be a problem," replied Margaret. "The director of the nursing home and Clara can witness." The next day, everything was ready. The director of the nursing home and Clara were called to Margaret's room to witness the signing of the new will. Clara, unaware of the document's contents, was curious and a bit apprehensive. "Clara, I want you to know that this document is very important to me," said Margaret, smiling, "and that you and your family are in it in a very special way." Clara was confused but smiled back. "We're happy to help, Mrs. Margaret." With all the papers signed, the lawyer confirmed that the change was official. Margaret felt a weight lifted off her shoulders. She knew she had done the right thing. After the lawyer left, Clara looked at Margaret, curious. "What is this about, Mrs. Margaret?" Margaret held Clara's hand, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I did something I believe is just, Clara, and I hope that one day you understand how much you mean to me." Clara hugged Margaret, feeling the depth of the moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret. You mean a lot to us, too." That night, Margaret slept peacefully, knowing that her decision would bring joy and security to those who truly deserved it. She had found her redemption through the love and kindness of Clara and her family. The reaction was immediate. The grandchildren started protesting, their voices full of anger. "This is absurd! How could she do this?" shouted one of them, while another slammed his hand on the table. The lawyer remained calm. "Your grandmother was fully aware of her actions and made this decision after much reflection. This will is legal and valid." As the grandchildren continued to argue, Clara arrived at the office, having been called by the director. She entered timidly, not fully understanding the situation. "Clara, your presence is needed here," said the director, gesturing for her to come closer. "Me? What's going on?" Clara asked, clearly confused. The lawyer turned to her with a gentle smile. "Clara, Mrs. Margaret left all her assets to you and your family. She wanted to acknowledge the kindness and care you showed her." Clara was in shock, speechless. This can't be true. We only did what any decent person would do." The grandchildren, now furious, tried to contest the decision, but the lawyer was firm. "The decision has been made and is legally recorded. There is nothing more to be done." Clara, still incredulous, began to cry. "I don't know what to say. This is unbelievable." The director placed his hand on Clara's shoulder. "You deserve it, Clara. Mrs. Margaret knew what she was doing." As the grandchildren left the office, grumbling and visibly upset, Clara stayed, trying to process what had just happened. She knew that her life and that of her family would change forever. Later that day, Clara went home and shared the news with John and the children. They were as shocked as she was, but also deeply grateful. "Margaret really left us all of this?" John asked, still trying to grasp the situation. "Yes," Clara replied, tears in her eyes. "She wanted to thank us for everything we did for her. I never imagined something like this." The family embraced, feeling a mix of sadness for Margaret's passing and gratitude for her generosity. In the following weeks, Clara and her family began to use the inheritance to improve their lives. They renovated their house, bought proper medical equipment for Pedro, and invested in their children's education. But more than that, they decided to honor Margaret's memory by helping others in need, just as she had done for them. "We will make a difference just like Margaret did," Clara said one day, as they discussed plans for a small community center they intended to open with part of the inheritance. As time passed, Clara's family prospered. Margaret's kindness and generosity not only changed their lives, but also inspired many others around them. And whenever they spoke about the transformation they experienced, they remembered Margaret with fondness and respect. Margaret, who had started her last days in despair, found redemption and peace through the love of Clara and her family. And Clara, who acted purely out of compassion, saw her life and that of her family transformed by a gesture